Thanks, folks. If you're like me, it's been a while since maybe being on a Zoom for one of these kind of workshops. So I'm a little clunky. I've got one screen. We'll see how it goes. I'll do my best to monitor the chat. It's nice to see you all here. I am super honored and grateful that you're here on a Monday night at the end of what I'm sure is a long day to talk about grading practices. My name is Nolan Fossum, and I'm currently teaching in San Diego at Mount Miguel High School, which is in the Grossmont district. I've worked more recently in Saddleback Valley. I spent a lot of years in Capo, and actually probably most of my time up in Orange County. Thank you so much for being here. I am adapting a version of a workshop about this ungrading framework that I typically would do in a 75 or 90-minute workshop session in person. So I'm adapting it. I have no idea how this will go for two 30-minute sessions. But my goal here in our first half hour is to run through some of the philosophy and introductory information about this ungrading framework I'm calling Pillars and Practices. And then if you are interested, you can come back for the Crash Course 3, where I'll get more into the nuts and bolts of what does it look like for lesson planning? What's it look like for math lessons? We'll do a little math together, talk a little bit more about assessment and evaluation, and hopefully leave some time for questions. All right, well, let's see what happens. I would encourage us to keep in mind these norms. I think anytime we're talking about grading practices, it can feel super personal, and that can put us maybe into an uncomfortable space. This is, of course, a place to experience discomfort and to speak our truth. I do not by any means profess to have all the answers. I'm just here to share with you some of what I've been thinking about and some of what I've been working to implement over the last few years. So if you would be so bold, either in the chat or please feel free to hop on the mic and just share a little bit of your thoughts, experiences, or challenges with grading, what may have inspired you to enter this session tonight.
I'll just speak out, Nolan, while other people might be typing. Yeah, I thought one of the things for me with grading was the inconsistency across different teachers, even though we're teaching kind of the same material, and how grades can be inconsistent in that way. And I struggled a lot with that because as much as we like to claim that we're being objective, clearly one student from getting an A on the same assignment as a student getting a C from a different teacher, or the way that the interpretation is coming is not balanced. And so that's one of the key areas that, I mean, we can go on and on, but one of the areas at least started me looking at it.
Thanks, Brent. There's a comment in the chat that says, can it ever be truly objective? Also a mention of fairness, motivation, qualifying prerequisites. And I remember that Robert Talbert, who does a lot of work with the Grading for Growth group, a higher ed group, had written a blog post maybe sometime last school year, and he articulated for me something that I was looking for the language to think about. And he had said that the entries in our grade books are essentially categorical data that we're treating as quantitative data. And so the idea that we can take a performance on some activity, another activity, a quiz, a test, and a bunch of things like that, and then put them into something meaningful as a summative score was not really something that we could accomplish well. And I think there's a sense in which we're all feeling that. Any other thoughts or comments before we move on?
And I have one. I've been out of the classroom for 17 years. So probably in the 90s when I was a Golden State exam reader and working with a rubric. And I was one of a number of teachers that did Golden State exam grading that looked at how we could change and do that in our classroom and came up with a 4 or 5 point generalized rubric that we kind of converted to percent scores, but not really, but made them go together. But it changed my teaching in so many ways because my students internalized that same one. And I wrote an article several years ago on focusing on the positive not the negative that was in the CMC communicator.
Thank you, Barb. I love that. And I think that's a lot of what I'm trying to accomplish with my framework too, all these years later, is still a way that's taking my own thinking away from looking at what students are doing wrong relative to the questions I'm writing, and then trying to find what it is maybe I'm not doing accurately to assess their learning. I love that. Thanks, everybody. This is a slide from Farshid Safi. He's a professor at University of Central Florida, and he uses it in a number of his workshops, and it really hit me the first time I saw it. These equitable mathematics teaching practices that come from this article that's way too small to read the contributors to. And if you recognize these things as things that sound great to you, you can drop a +1 in the chat or some kind of a reaction on the Zoom screen. But I look at this and I'm thinking, wow, like this is exactly the stuff that I aspire to be doing in my class, right? Building on students' funds of knowledges and positioning students as capable and monitoring how students position each other and pressing for academic success, all these things. My sad reality was that so much of my work ended up kind of looking like this, where in the end, my tests, quizzes, and homework weren't necessarily reflecting those things I was aspiring to promote in my lesson design, let's say. And so that's sort of what inspired my journey to come back to these things and think about, you know, and there's other lists like these, but how can I make sure that these things are really getting their value in the way that students are being assessed and evaluated? So for me, I realized I can't do that without thinking about grading and the effects it has on students' identities. We all know that research is pretty clear. Students get back a paper and they look at the score, and that's all they look at. And if they look at a second thing, it's someone else's score. But they very infrequently look at the feedback as a source of learning from their mistakes or from whatever's on the page, but instead they're just sort of seeing that score and then it burns into their identity. We also know that grading is tied up with agency and students' abilities to feel like they can be capable math students. And we, of course, can't deny that grading is like integral in terms of tracking and access issues. And a lot of these are the things that are mentioned in the Catalyzing Change series. And that's some of where back in 2020, when I read that book, it like really inspired a lot of my thinking about what should I be attending to. And so for me, it turned out to be thinking about ungrading as the way I can be attending to the work of identity agency and thinking about issues pertaining to tracking and access. All right, so I thought we should take a moment to try and define ungrading. I'm not actually sure that I know how to do it. I do like Jesse Stommel's quote here: ungrading means raising an eyebrow at grades as a systemic practice. And so I have a really broad view of ungrading. I don't have a view that some take that there's sort of like a traditional grading model, and then you move towards something like a standards-based grading model, where the ideal is to move sort of down the line until you're like, grades, who needs them? And I definitely have strong feelings about grades and who needs them. But at the same time, I think of anything that falls under this umbrella of raising an eyebrow at grades as a systemic practice and a problematic practice is something under the umbrella of ungrading. And there's some great stuff here in Jesse Stommel's work, as well as this article from Sean Michael Morris. And if you're interested in any of the resources that you see tonight at any point, this link, bit.ly.pillarspractices, I'll drop it in the chat. It's possible I'll spell it correctly. This will take you to a brief form. You can give me your email and I will follow up with tonight's slides, a bunch of information and resources. If you have any interest in my very, very, very occasional newsletter about my ungrading practices and experiences, you can go to that link. So Rogelio just asked if I can share a link, and that link will get you access to those things. It'll show up at least at the end and probably maybe once or twice more. I'll try to remember to drop it later as well. All right, so this message is for you. We can do hard things. And I think that when it comes to looking at the entrenchment of traditional grading practices and even the experimentation with some alternative grading practices, which in my personal experience have been very logistically difficult to implement, my message for us is we can do hard things. We can find ways to interact with this space, knowing that it isn't easy, but it's worthwhile. And this message is really for myself as much as it's for any of us, because my ungrading journey has more or less looked like this. And I'd say I began this process in a college algebra class that I was teaching in the evenings a couple of years ago. It was mid-pandemic, so this is all over Zoom. And it was really just like, I don't know, let's try it. And I changed my syllabus last minute. And there were some things that really struck with students, and they've encouraged me to keep moving, but there were just so many things where it's like, well, that's not really clear, and students need more direction here, and I don't know what I'm doing. So as I've sort of stepped through the process, it's really felt a lot like this of Grommet laying the tracks as he goes. Last year, I implemented some form of an ungrading mode in my high school classes. This was geometry and statistics. And this year I'm implementing it at my new school in integrated math 2 and math 3. And as I go each time, I have a little bit more purpose and direction, always based on my previous experiences. And if you're doing this already, as I continue to start meeting folks who have been doing this, I would love to connect and share some of, you can share some of your journey and experience and expertise with me. So here's a few of the lessons that have come out of this. And it's number one is to remain mindful of whom I serve as a teacher. And I've worked in schools that have diversity in terms of student success, student ethnic and racial backgrounds, students socioeconomic backgrounds, neurodiverse students, neurotypical students. I've worked in, middle class to upper middle class suburban districts and schools. I've worked in relatively elite private schools. I've worked in schools where the majority of students are on free and reduced lunch programs. So I've kind of seen all of it. And I believe that every student needs this. I believe the students who are successful in school because they know how to play the game of school need something that helps redirect them towards a path of learning first, not just getting good grades. And I especially think that it's our students who've been the most marginalized in the school setting, and particularly in the math classroom, that need this. And so a lot of my thinking around this has been inspired by Goldie Mohammed's book, Cultivating Genius. And this quotation here really speaks to me, that our Black students, and that's true in our area of our Latino students and our special ed students, and just a lot of our students in general, are not the ones that are failing. It is the systems, instruction, and standards that are created to monitor, control, and measure a very narrow definition of achievement that are off the mark. All right, I see I'm running out of time, so I'm already going to go fast. My second lesson is that I can affect change within the systems, instruction, and standards, that I don't need to wait for a district level move or a school level initiative, that I can start this stuff in my own classroom and experiment, play around, and keep adjusting based on student feedback, parent feedback, administrative feedback. But this quote from Street Data really strikes me too, that for all our talk of being student-centered, we've bought into a success paradigm that robs many children of their voices, marginalizes their gifts, and prioritizes measurement and incremental improvement over learning and transformation. And my third lesson is that ungrading is really a tool for critical pedagogy. And if you're familiar with the CARE framework, you may know that this top band here of affirming the dignity and humanity of all people is something that I definitely think was not on my mind most of my career, and it takes a constant reminder to keep that in mind. I like this part over here on the top left about creating just systems, and I'm thinking about just grading systems. And then also over here on the right, embracing historical truths that not all students have been successful in school, because school hasn't really been designed for all students to be successful. So these are things on my mind. If you want to learn more about the CARE framework, here's a link, and that link will also be available in the resources. All right, so with our few minutes that are here, I want to share a little bit of the intro to the framework. The Pillars and Practices framework has the 4 pillars. That's the student-facing side. I think of this as guidance for students and the way they interact in the classroom when points are no longer available as sort of a measure of, am I being successful? And the practices we'll get into more detail with. I think of that as the teacher-facing half of the framework. And this is to guidance to redefine success for each student, and in turn to help us think about how we alter our practices for that end. And so when I got rid of points, I had to replace it with something so students would know how to be successful in my class, and that's where the 4 pillars come into play. So my pillars are engagement, understanding, communication, and authenticity. And for the students who have been successful in school, I'm trying to get them past this sort of race to earn points and focus on what are they doing that are sort of the studenting kinds of behaviors that I want to see. Things like growing, things like attending to the way they interact in groups, the things like challenging themselves to be even better, even though they may come in with a lot of knowledge. Understanding is one of those things that for me is basically about the content that students understand, as well as their ability to articulate the way they're thinking about things. And for me, it's a lot larger than just right answers and wrong answers, but really about a window into students' thinking. Communication sort of reaches on that as well. It also affects sort of how students interact in their groups. It's about that process of seeing ourselves as partners on the same learning journey, that the more that we interact with each other and share a common interest in how are things going, the social emotional needs of students, not just the academic needs, that we can build that strong partnership. And authenticity for me is that sort of umbrella pillar that's like, hey, you don't have to come in and fake it till you make it. Your goal here is to come in and be who you are, and we'll address the inequities of the system and how I can serve you. So these are all developing. And in the end, they're the sort of things that I need to define with my students, because I have some ideas about these things, but I'm continuing to learn more and more as I interact with students on how I can best identify their brilliance. All right, that was really quick. I have a little bit more articulation of that also in the resources. For the practices, the critical elements here is that it starts with mindset work. And I'm afraid I don't think I have time to show a little 3-minute video clip from Dr. Yolanda Seeley-Ruiz, but I have that also linked in my resources. And essentially, Dr. Seeley-Ruiz out of Teachers College, Columbia University, has this theory about the archaeology of the self. And this is that idea that unless we dig deep into who we are as educators and what we bring into the educational space, we can't really know our students or know how best to solve our students. And she goes on to argue that if we don't do that work of digging into who we are and what we bring, we can actually end up exacting harm on our students. It's a great clip. Honestly, we should have just listened to that for 30 minutes instead of me, but I have that linked. Following that mindset work, that how I, especially in my position as a middle-aged white teacher, serving students that don't share a lot of my identity markers and my positions of privilege, the next is a leap of faith. And for me, that leap of faith starts with ditching task-based grading categories. So here's a little meme that sort of gets to the idea of what I'm thinking about. For years and years and years, my grades were based off of the traditional categories: tests, quizzes, homework, sometimes participation or not, different things like that. We get together as a PLC at the beginning of the year and talk about what % each category should be. And this is what a lot of our teacher meetings, in my experience, have been like, and still are, to be honest. But one of the things I'm realizing is what's mentioned over here on the right, that our tests are flawed instruments. I've actually never had a class in writing a good test. I think I'm pretty good at it. And yet I have to acknowledge that our grades don't measure what we think they do or what we want them to. Oftentimes, there's just so much noise and variability in how students perform and the instruments that I'm creating. So one thing I have in mind with that is one experience that my college algebra students have done is we'll find a typical college algebra final exam. We'll just Google search college algebra final exam PDF, and the one with the most search results is the one we'll take a look at. So this question comes from there. And I think by any accounts, this seems like a fairly reasonable college algebra exam, final exam question, solve for the variable X in the equation. And there's a lot of other stuff about this exam that's worth thinking about if we had more time, but here's what I want students to be thinking about. In a question like this, over here on the right, we can solve this with the Desmos graphing calculator, requiring no literal algebraic skills. So therefore, then what is this problem actually about? What does this problem assess? And what's it not assessing? And if you are interested to come back in part 2 during course 3, we'll go a little bit deeper into an alternate way to think about this question. But for me, I'm thinking about the number of times I might have problems like this and what I would do to support students. Maybe I have a practice or a review with similar kinds of questions that we can work on the day or two before. And it really gets into the heart of when a student is successful with this question, is it really telling me about their mathematical capability, or is it telling me more about their ability to be successful in typical school structures? So with those things in mind, I decided I was going to launch into this and get rid of gradebook categories. No tests, no quizzes. I give those things, but they're not the grading categories. in the evaluation system. More about that in part 2. Next is reimagining success. And my basic claim here is that for the last, 10, 20 years, we've had so much focus on the content standards that we've actually lost sight of what it is that we're after, the magic, and whether we're actually bound to the standards rather than just based in the standards. And I feel like this may be a bold claim. I'm not suggesting we get rid of the content. I'm a strong believer in grade level content for all of our learners. But I also think that it's a disingenuous measure that if I have, let's say, 80 content standards in my IM2 class, that a student will earn an A if they master 90% of those content standards, and a B if they master 80% of those content standards. And the reason I feel this is disingenuous is that I actually can't certify that my students have mastered those things. All I have is an artifact that says they got these questions right on this instrument. And there's so much about how did they get those questions right? Did they still remember those things? Can they apply them later? What about the students who just aren't there yet? And that's a lot of the things that standards-based grading and other kinds of equity-based grading practices have started to address. But I also feel that for our focus on getting through the content, we're losing a lot of opportunities to look at some other aspects of our responsibility as educators. And I'm not afraid that we're ever going to lose the content as a context. And for me, that's like fundamental. The content is my context. But instead, I think that if we're going to offer a genuine pathway to success for every student, it needs to be something that every student can be successful with. And so I'm choosing as my standards or my practices in the practices side of the framework, the standards for mathematical practice. And I feel like number 1, this is a reasonably short list. 2, every student comes in with some sort of, let's say, gradation or ability in these 8 categories, and every student can grow in these 8 categories. That goes from my students who typically earn really good grades easily in a math classroom. There are ways for them to improve in these things, and I want to have ways to challenge them. But this also goes especially for those students who have traditionally had horrible experiences in math classes, who are prone to give up in a math class because why bother trying? I'm too far behind. I'll never be successful. I feel like this gives every student a chance to say, let's set a marker of success for you. And if you're open to the notion, as was mentioned earlier, that could grading processes ever be truly objective, I kind of believe that we should individualize a little bit in the context of our content and set reasonable standards for what growth would look like for each student in these 8 practices for them to be considered successful in our courses. And I truly believe that the students who are successful in these 8 things will go on to be more resourceful, more successful in further math classes, whereas the students who are not growing in these 8 things, regardless of the amount of right answers and wrong answers, are probably not prepared to be successful as they grow as independent learners. All right, so that's reimagined success. I'm going at a relatively rapid rate, so I think we're gonna make it here on time. Most of what I have in these remaining 2 bullets about aligning instruction and talking about assessment is gonna come up in part 2 after the break. If you're interested in those things and doing a little math and seeing how it looks, feel free to come back. So I wanted to end here with what I'm thinking of as a commitment to criticality. And this is that piece that with a focus on the content standards, I've often just said, well, this sounds great, but I don't have time. I don't really know how to do it. It sounds like a lot of work to figure it out. And I don't really know where I'd fit it anyways, because I have so much content to get through. So this is actually brand new based on a workshop I attended last week at NCTM. Hopefully some of you were there as well and got a great experience like I did. But I attended the pre-conference workshop on Wednesday. And Catherine Ye, who formerly was a professor in math education at Chapman University, has now moved to University of Texas, Austin, led part of the workshop, and she is editor on one of the new books in this series. She is editor on the upper elementary mathematics lessons, the blue one here. And this one particular lesson, Tu Lucha es Mi Lucha, is about United Farm Workers of America, and particularly the story of Larry Itliong, a Filipino activist who did a lot to move this movement forward and is often not recognized, especially to the degree that Cesar Chavez, also participating in this work, was. And so for me, it was a really fascinating story. And the social justice connections in this upper elementary book are really, really dynamic. And they get into the mathematical content of that grade level, which was like decimals and operations with those kinds of things. And so I'm trying currently to adapt it to high school level. So I'm thinking about how I can take that decimal work and easily apply it to something about linear functions, for example, in Algebra 1 or integrated 1 context. And I'm still working through how that might go, but this is the sort of stuff that I really feel like is relevant and engaging for students in using mathematics as a lens to make sense out of our world. And it's something that I've done very little of. Even when I've wanted to, I just haven't really known how. So part of opening up this idea to the practices is I can easily see how I can be building students' growth in the practices with lessons that attend to social justice standards as well as content standards. Something else I've been working on for a while is reimagining my course unit progressions. So in every course I teach, my first 2 units are called Identity and Representation and Epistemology. And then the other unit titles are based on words, and everything here has an intended double meaning. And a lot of this is sort of me thinking about how I can build Goldie Mohammed's framework into my math classes. So here's an excerpt from my unit design framework, or whatever it's called. So my identity and representation has a focus on self and society. That's that critical piece. That's that identity and agency piece, as well as a focus on the content. And this is, always in progress. It doesn't necessarily have lessons attached to it at this particular juncture, but that's something I'm working on. But in addition to, students learning fundamental terms and getting the basics of definitions, postulates, theorems, and simple concepts of geometry, I also want them to be thinking about who they are as math students. What are their beliefs about themselves and others, and how do others view them, and all those kinds of selves. For the epistemology unit, ties in really nicely with the idea of proof. Oops. But I also want them to think about where our ideas about ourselves and others come from. Why do we believe those things? And start to look critically at mathematics as a tool that people use, whether it's intentional or inadvertently, to impact the way people think. All right, with our remaining 2 moments, let me just mention that here's a couple more of the units. In geometry, proximity deals with essentially location and distance. For fun, we could get into some vectors or non-Euclidean geometry, but for me, it's like the Pythagorean theorem and the distance formula and those kinds of things. But as we move on, there's always sort of this middle column, which is getting me to think critically about students viewing math. And maybe it would be like 1 anchor unit or 1 anchor lesson in the unit, along with those other skills developing it. So that's something that's a work in progress for me. All right, I'm barely in under the wire. We've got a moment for your questions. Feel free to hop on. I'm going to drop that link in the chat one more time if you want those resources or anything you saw here today, or have feedback, or would like a copy of my very, very occasional newsletters. And if you'd like to get a little bit deeper and do some math and see how I use this framework to address instruction and assessment and portfolios, please join us at the next one. Thanks so much, folks.